Hello and welcome to Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. My name is Brian Perez, and we are here live on this Thursday afternoon, the 13th of July, and we are ready to do a program today. Now, it's Thursday. You know what that means. We're going to be here for 2 hours from 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. But the second hour is going to be when we're going to take questions. We're not necessarily going to take questions this first hour because we have got a very special guest. And I'll tell you who that is after I tell you who our not so special guests are. No, I'm joking. It's just we see these guys all the time. So, but they're great. Of course they are. And we saw them yesterday at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. That was so much fun. We'll talk about that later. But Pastor Brian Broderson, the senior pastor of Calvary Costa Mesa, is in the studio. So is Bobby Conway from Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's visiting us here in SoCal, and you can also find out more about Bobby at ChristianityStillMakesSense.com. That's also his YouTube channel. And our very special guest joining us via Skype is Justin Briley. I hope I said it right this time, because last time you were here, Justin, I could not get your name right because you spell it differently. It looks like it would be Brierly, but Pastor Brian said, no, just take out that middle syllable, and it's more like Briley. So
you got it perfect.
It's good.
Right.
Justin is in the UK, where it is currently almost midnight, and so if he falls asleep during the program, we'll have to sing and dance to keep him awake. And nice T-shirt, Justin Briley. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. This K-Wave T-shirt that I'm wearing, I actually got in 2019. I went to a concert with my teenage son Noah while I was in California. Lecrae was playing along with other artists, and there was a K-Wave stall, and I got this free T-shirt, and I've been wearing it ever since. It's one of my favorite T-shirts. So yeah, nice. You guys are with me here in the UK.
That's great. Well, that's great, Justin. Now that you're kind of a free agent, you can do promotion for another radio station.
Yeah.
Where that might have been a little bit risky before, but
yes.
Yeah. Well, you're referring to the fact, of course, Brian, that many people know that I've been hosting the Unbelievable show for many years, over 17 and a half years, in fact. And that's on Premier Christian Radio here in the UK. But yeah, I did recently move on from hosting the show. So it was the end of an era, as they say, because really that show I'd founded and hosted for all those years. It's been such a privilege to have so many conversations between Christians and atheists on it. But the Lord was moving me on to some new pastures and some really exciting new projects. So I'm really excited about those and what's yet to come.
Yeah, and that's such a great program. So many episodes that were just fantastic. Bobby and I shared a lot of those together, listening and then having conversations. And on the one hand, I knew, darn, I like Unbelievable, and what are we going to do now? But I had every confidence that you weren't going into retirement, that you were going to continue to do similar kinds of things. So, but I have been sort of wondering a little bit about, just how to really connect with your current ministry and what you're doing. And then, this morning I was on a jog and I was listening to a podcast that I listened to from some friends in the UK, Andy Bannister, and Justin happened to be on, and they were interviewing Justin about the book. So I got a little more insight into some of the stuff that's currently happening. But I figured today you can give us the down low on how to stay connected and, what to look forward to in the future.
Yeah.
But, of course, the big thing to look forward to is your new book.
Yes, this is Justin's second book. He wrote one in 2017 called Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And I love that title because so many Christians think, man, I can't talk to an atheist because what if they start talking down my faith and then I'm just going to start, doubting everything that I believe. So like Justin's first book says, he spoke with atheists. He interviewed them, skeptics and everything, and he's still strong. So it can be done.
And that was a great book.
Yes, it was.
I really enjoyed that book.
Justin's new book comes out in September, and it's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And we'll tell you how you can purchase a copy. In fact, if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, the link should already be up there so that you can find out more about it and make a purchase. But tell us about this new book, Justin Briley.
Yeah, well, the first book was really all about making the case for faith, and it was done on the basis of looking at some of the arguments and discussions that we'd had over the years on The Unbelievable Show. And that was a great way of kind of digging into the historical and philosophical and scientific evidence for Christianity. This book is still an apologetics book. It's still about making the case for Christianity, but it's doing it much more from a cultural angle, really. And it's really a snapshot of where we are currently in the West. Many people will know that in the West, especially in the UK and Europe, church going has been on a steady decline for a number of decades. Just last year, for the first time, the number of people who ticked the Christian box here in the UK on the national survey was under 50%. So most people describing themselves as non-religious. And we know that there's been the growth of the so-called nuns, those who claim no religious affiliation, all over the place, especially in the US, especially among younger people. So that's the general picture. And I think a lot of people just assume, well, that's the direction that things are heading. Secularization is on the rise. That's kind of, Christianity one day will probably die out. Well, this is a book really that actually questions that and says, actually, something interesting is happening. Because what I noticed is that when the show began, when My Unbelievable Show began, most of the debates were really coming out of that new atheist movement. So this was led by people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, very dogmatic atheists who were saying not only did they not believe in God, but religion was evil. And they were really evangelistically trying to persuade people out of Christianity, out of faith altogether. And to some extent, that was great for the show. It was a great thing to be able to respond to and engage with. It really helped to kind of, cement some of those big debates and apologetics arguments and conversations over the years. But what I noticed, especially in more recent years, was that those kinds of discussions were becoming less frequent on my show. And I was actually turning to more secular thinkers who were actually somewhat sympathetic to Christianity. Indeed, what I discovered really was that the new atheism itself was a relatively short-lived phenomenon. It kind of had a big publishing boom. There were, the best-selling books, lots of conferences. But actually, as I explain in the book, it kind of ended up tearing itself apart because once its chief architects had agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, they basically couldn't agree on anything else. And having kind of ripped down God, they really didn't have anything to put in God's place. And so they all started kind of falling out with each other over all of the big hot button issues that we're, form the culture wars today.
Wow.
Going off in different directions to the point where none of them were even able to really share a stage with each other at their conferences and things like that. And it got to the point where actually they were more vociferously harsh to each other than they ever were to their Christian opponents. So this was all happening in the kind of the atheist world. And at the same time, I was noticing that people were no longer, a lot of the secular folk that I was engaging with weren't really listening any longer to Dawkins and Hitchens and co. But they were actually turning to some interesting other secular intellectuals who were filling auditoriums, people like Jordan Peterson, the well-known Canadian psychologist, people like Tom Holland, a British historian here in the UK who's written a best-selling book called Dominion, people like Douglas Murray, a journalist here in the UK, all secular people, but all people who have actually decided, you know what, Christianity isn't all bad. In fact, we're not sure we can actually live without something like the Christian story in the West. There's been this new appreciation, this new, much more nuanced conversation about the value of religion among many of these secular intellectuals. So I was noticing this kind of sea change in the way people were thinking about Christianity, about faith. And coupled with that, I was noticing a lot of thinking adults converting to Christianity. Now, this was not like a mass revival or anything, but I was just hearing story after story of unlikely converts. And it just made me wonder, maybe we're just starting to see the tide change. I begin the book by quoting a Victorian poet called Matthew Arnold, who wrote a famous poem called Dover Beach, where he described the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. This was his metaphor for the way that the Victorian sort of scientific era and the Enlightenment had caused faith to essentially recede from the shores of Europe and the West. But actually, it was a conversation with Douglas Murray, this atheist journalist, a couple of years ago, where he referenced that line and he said, well, the thing about tides is, Justin, they do come back in again. And he was talking about the fact that he was seeing among some of his secular peers, an interesting number of them had converted to Christianity. And that was really what gave me the image for the front cover of the book. It's a tide coming back in. And I think we may just be seeing the tide turn on atheism. People kind of getting tired of that materialistic story, looking for something new. And I think the Christian story could be the thing that comes sweeping back in, even within our generation. So that's the big picture, really, of the book.
You know, if I might just give our audience a little picture of Justin. I love Justin Briley, and I know you do, Brian. He's one of my favorite people, and I am so thankful for the tone, Justin, that you have presented and modeled for us as Christians. You are proof in the pudding that Christians can dialogue with atheists, have meaningful conversations. And many ways, you've allowed a conversation to happen, but by your kind, humble demeanor, you have modeled something, in my opinion, that my favorite part of Unbelievable is Justin Briley. It's who you are, your humility. I mean, you're an Oxford graduate. You are so humble. You make time for people. I think about the two times that I got a chance to sit down with Justin. First time I met Justin, I was in England. I was working on my PhD at Birmingham, and I reached out and said, I'd love to meet you. And we had an opportunity to connect for about 15 minutes at a Subway in London. He didn't have much time, but we chatted. And then in California, Brian, you brought Justin out for a conference, and I offered to show him around, and he didn't have as much time. So what we did is we got a cup of coffee, and as a good husband would, he said, my wife loves Bath and Body Works. Well, they don't have Bath and Body Works in the UK, apparently. So here is Justin and I, and he's creating a bit of self-consciousness in me, walking into Bath and Body Works together with him as we're smelling different things together that he could get for his bride. Well, lo and behold, after that, we had so much fun with it that when I would bump into different Bath and Body Works, I would take a picture and send it to him and say, just thinking about you, bro.
Yeah, it really cemented our relationship in a whole new way. That
That's right, man.
Bobby, yeah.
You know, Justin. One of the things that I am really appreciating about just the little bit I read over the foreword. I think N.T. Wright did the foreword, correct?
Yeah, N.T. Wright did the foreword.
Yeah, I read the foreword, and then I think the introduction and the first chapter last night, and then listening to your conversation with Andy and Aaron. And I love that you said this, and I'm with you on this. You said, because, they were bringing up some these guys are talking about the Christian faith, but are they really talking about, being Christians, being real Jesus followers, or are they just talking about something cultural? And, you had some good responses to that. But then you said, I just kind of believe, this is sort of a faith thing for me, that I just believe that maybe God is doing something and we're starting to see that. And I love that because I feel the same way. I think that some of the people we're talking about, like maybe a Jordan Peterson or Tom Holland or Douglas Murray, which I'm familiar with all of them. And I love, I've heard your conversations with Tom Holland. I've heard N.T. Wright's conversations with Tom Holland. I've had some interaction with him with some other people. And I just am so excited. And I understand that he hasn't become a Christian in the biblical sense at this point. But I find it fascinating that he is so interested in, of course, the whole book Dominion is about the influence of Christianity on the Western world. But then even on a personal level, and I remember, Justin, one time when you were interviewing him, I think somehow it came up that somebody had either written or said something about praying for him. And his response was, thank you, and keep praying for me, because I would like to, he pretty much said, I would like to have that experience,
I mean, it's interesting for those who aren't familiar with Tom Holland. If I give a little bit of background to his story, and he won't mind me doing this. We're friends, and he basically co-hosts probably the world's leading history podcast. It's called The Rest Is History, which he does with his friend Dominic Sandbrook, and it's incredibly popular. It's always top of the Apple history charts. Well, top of the charts, full stop. He's also wrote a number of best-selling historical books, really on ancient Greece and Rome and the Middle Ages, and he's just a fascinating character. But what really struck me was when several years ago I ran into an article he'd written in the New Statesman called "Why I Changed My Mind About Christianity," and really it encapsulated what he then went on to write a few years later in a huge book called Dominion, which is the story of how he, as a secular historian who kind of had a childhood faith, but it kind of fizzled out by his teenage years, when he actually went and investigated the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans, what he discovered there was so very alien to his own way of thinking in terms of the way they thought about human life, the fact that slavery simply was part of the economy and just an absolute assumption that the life of infants was absolutely cheap in so many ways, that women obviously were treated in such a different way. He realized that as much as he kind of loved investigating and sort of being caught up in the drama of the Greeks and the Romans, he realized it was a very different place to the place he lived and breathed and what everything he valued as a Westerner. And he came to realize that the values he held didn't arise from science or reason or the Enlightenment. He came to realize that the Christian revolution 2,000 years ago was what changed the world, that everything that he holds dear about the values of equality, dignity, personhood, and so on, they stemmed from Jesus Christ. And it was this kind of gradual dawning realization on him that he said, I realized that in almost every way, I am actually a Christian. That was the way he put it. He said, I may not believe the supernatural aspects of this, but I am completely conditioned by Christianity, just by the fact that I am a, Western person living in a democratic society. And he's gone on to have all kinds of interesting debates and lectures and so on with atheists who, obviously take a different view. What's interesting with Tom is he definitely has been on also a spiritual journey. And every time I've spoken to him about it, he talks about a great yearning he has. He really wants it to be true. He says that he finds the materialist, secularist narrative sort of very pallid and boring by comparison with the Christian story. And I think in his own way, actually, he is sort of arriving there. I know that he attends church as often as he can. He wants to kind of be around the mystery of Christianity. So, who knows exactly where any individual is on their personal journey, but what's fascinating to me is that I think Tom Holland, in a funny way, is one of the best evangelists that the UK have, because you will hear him talking in these ways about Christianity on this podcast that reaches literally millions of people every week. So I just find that a very encouraging thing that here's someone, a really intelligent, well thought of, respected historian in the West, really taking Christianity seriously, and that is a big change.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful, and I love sometimes even the banter between him and Dominic Sandbrook, where something is going to sort of ultimately come around to Christianity or Jesus, and Dominic's like, "Okay, Tom, here we go. We know that this is where you were really trying to lead the program in the first place." So. Yeah, that's so good. Justin, here's something that I think maybe Andy or Aaron said to you, and we're just kind of jumping all around here. These are the things that are fresh on my mind. But so we're talking about here. We're broadcasting obviously in the U.S., and even beside Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland is still. He's Spider-Man here in the U.S. He's not a British historian, and even though he's also British, but then like Douglas Murray and so forth, and when you were having the conversation with Andy, they were talking about, okay, here are these guys. These are sort of real high-level, intellectual, cultured people. Not too many people on an average are going to even know these names or who these are. So their point was, what about stories that take it down to kind of just the common man level. And it seems like from some of the stuff I read in your book that you've even included a few stories. You had a few names of people that I didn't recognize, so I'm assuming that you're tapping into that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's certainly, I think it's going on at lots of different levels. So there's those who perhaps are kind of more kind of your literary figures and your cultural kind of, commentators and so on who, may not exactly be everyone knows or anything like that. But it's interesting that they are kind of giving permission at some level for people in those kinds of arenas to take the idea of Christianity and God seriously. But, many of these people are best-selling authors. So, they do have a real audience. Yeah. I'm thinking, of someone like Jonathan Haidt, for instance, who again is one of these people who's a sort of secular psychologist, but he's written some best-selling books on the happiness principle, on the righteous mind. And again, he's someone who is taking ancient wisdom seriously. He's of the same sort of generation as many of those new atheists, but while they were all kind of busy dismissing God, when he came on my show to talk about his sort of journey, he said, what I was seeing was the way in which religion and Christianity in particular has given shape and purpose, and the way that it has positively benefited people of faith for millennia now. And he wrote a whole book really on the way in which that comes true in people's lives, having been around people. And so when you've got these interesting people, it does filter down, not just from the academic side, but a lot of these are popular people who have, can fill auditoriums, whose, YouTube channels are fantastically popular, the podcasts, and everything. And I was increasingly seeing in the conversations I was having with, as it were, yes, educated kind of people, but people who kind of weren't necessarily sold on the Christian thing. I was increasingly hearing from them a different kind of thing to what you once might have expected, which was the sort of the Dawkins new atheist thing of, oh, well, we know that religion's just a myth and, we're better off without it. I was increasingly hearing people saying things that sounded more like, these Jordan Peterson type characters, that actually, we need something like religion to make sense of life. I can see why people, gravitate towards that. I can see how it has shaped our culture for the better. And if you actually go and read, Jordan Peterson's book, whatever you think of him as as a kind of cultural commentator, it's extraordinary to see the way in which he constantly references the Bible, as he seeks to show the way in which humankind, the world, has been the benefactor of the Judeo-Christian worldview. He says the very idea of human equality and dignity basically only exists because it's spelled out on the first pages of Genesis when people are made in the image of God. He says you don't get that idea anywhere else than in the Christian Bible. So it's interesting to me that these people are suddenly kind of opening a doorway to other people who probably would have once dismissed Christianity, but are now feeling like they can kind of perhaps possibly take it seriously intellectually.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Jordan Peterson is packing out auditoriums with people who aren't necessarily Christian or coming to hear an evangelistic type of a message. They're coming because they resonate with other things that he's saying. But like you're saying, as he just sort of sometimes even makes these off-the-cuff comments that are positive toward faith, that can have an impact within those groups of people. So I think all of that is good.
Yeah. Justin, let me ask you a question, bud. As you think about your book coming out, what are some of the key takeaways that you would hope that readers would find in your book, and when does your book publish?
Well, the book comes out in September, but it's available to pre-order now, and you can go straight to my website to do that if you want. That's at justinbriley.com. In fact, I'm also working on a podcast documentary series that will accompany the release of the book in September. So look out for that. It'll be a kind of expanded version, really, of the book via podcast. But maybe some of the key takeaways are I mean, one of the things that I think it's worth bearing in mind is that even though we live in an increasingly secular age, a post-Christian age, I don't think the religious impulse has actually gone away. Religion never really goes away even in the absence of the Christian story, people just get religious about different things. And I think this has always been true. And I think we are seeing that in our culture at the moment, because even when you talk to a quote unquote non-religious person, they probably treat some things as ultimate and sacred in their life. And these days, those are often justice issues, equality issues. They're issues perhaps around LGBT or race or gender or identity. And it's just interesting to see that the way that those kinds of issues have kind of become a bit of a placeholder for some people. It's a kind of quasi-religious thing, to the extent that in some of those movements, those ideologies, that they take on a very religious character. You do sometimes have your holy texts. The key people are the high priests. You've got, there are certain types of creed that you have to kind of agree to, and if you don't, you become a heretic. You're shunned. You're on the out group, and the modern equivalent of a witch trial is a sort of cancellation on social media and that kind of thing. So there's a religious instinct that's still there. It's just being channeled in the wrong directions, and it's not that often these things are necessarily bad in and of themselves. The drive for equality is a good thing, but when we kind of make those the ultimate thing, they do become idols. And sadly, religion usually goes quite toxic when it doesn't involve Jesus and the concept of grace and forgiveness. And so I think we're kind of living now in a culture which is, in a funny way, is still quite religious. It's just they've got the wrong religion, and people are looking for a story. They look that the reason the new atheism failed, partly, apart from the fact it kind of tore itself apart from the inside, is that it failed to give people a satisfactory story to live their lives by. Saying science and reason alone, that just didn't do it. That wasn't enough for people. We're made for something more. We're made to see ourselves as part of something bigger. And when because so much of the West has lost the Christian story, people are now scrabbling around for all kinds of other stories, and we're having to kind of invent our identities from scratch. And it's exhausting, and it's part of the reason why we're seeing the rise in anxiety and depression among young people. It's because they're all looking for identity, purpose, and meaning, and they're kind of having to create it from scratch in a very confusing culture. And I just and what I think we're seeing is it's almost like culture almost has to get to that breaking point before people realize we can't save ourselves. And there is actually a story that's waiting for us, that's been around and has stood the test of time for 2,000 years. And yes, it's come and gone at various points in history, but it tends to always come back. And I think we're going to see that story come back. And some of the stories I tell in the book are precisely of those people who suddenly found, after trying everything else, that actually this was the story that made sense of their life after all.
If you've just joined us, you're listening to Pastor's Perspective. My name is Brian Perez, and we've got Brian Broderson and Bobby Conway here. And our special guest via Skype, all the way from England, it's Justin Briley, who is a broadcaster in the UK, a writer and a speaker. You may have heard of him on the Unbelievable podcast. He's also got another podcast he used to do called the Ask NT Write Anything podcast. And now he's working on a new podcast. It's called Re-Enchanting. If you go look for that online, be careful, because I found other podcasts with similar names. You don't want to look at those. It's called Re-Enchanting, I-N-G at the end. And he's also going to be doing another podcast soon that has the same title as the book that is coming out in September. And that title is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You can pre-order the book now at Justin's website, justinbriley.com. Good luck spelling it. I'll spell it for you. Justin, of course, Justin. Brierley is Brierley. It's pronounced more like Briley, but it's Brierley, justinbrierley.com. So check that out. And we've got to take a break, and then we'll be back with more of our conversation with Justin in just a little bit here on Pastor's Perspective. I'm kind of curious to know, maybe we can talk about this when we come back, is the new atheists, you say that the whole movement kind of fell apart from within. What kind of disagreements that these new atheists have that they couldn't even share the same stage? You would think that atheists would just be united under the fact that they don't believe in God, but I guess they've got schisms and stuff themselves. So maybe we can talk about that when we come back in just a couple of minutes here on Pastor's Perspective. Stand by. back on Pastor's Perspective. I'm Brian Perez here in the studio with Brian Broderson and Bobby Conway, and we've got a special guest joining us from England on Skype. It is Justin Briley, who's talking about the new book that he wrote. It's coming out in September. You can pre-order it now on his website, justinbriley.com. Briley spelled, surprisingly, Brierley. So Brierley is more if you're trying to remember if you can't write it down right now, just kind of remember it that way. But right before the break, we were talking about, during the first half of the program, Justin mentioned how part of the reason the new atheist movement kind of fizzled out is because it was dying from within and all these arguments that they were having with each other. And I just thought atheists would agree on everything because they have this united front, but I guess not, Justin?
No, not at all. In fact, I mean, I kind of locate one of the key moments when the new atheism really started to unravel in 2011. It was at a skeptical conference, which was being attended by people like Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world, and this was in Dublin, in Ireland. And one of the speakers at this conference was a woman called Rebecca Watson, who ran a blog called Skeptic. And she gave a speech at this conference about her concerns about sexism and misogyny in the atheist community that she was running into quite frequently. Anyway, she did her talk and then, stayed up till quite late into the night. I think it was about 4 a.m. in the morning, drinking at the bar with some of the other speakers. And she went to go into the elevator to return to her room at about that time. And another male delegate from the conference got in and essentially propositioned her in the elevator, said, basically, do you want to come back to my room for coffee, sort of thing. And she said no, and sort of that was the end of it. But then she then sort of vlogged about her experience afterwards and said, this is like symptomatic of what's going on in the atheist community, that after I've just done a talk of this type, someone would take it upon themselves to proposition me, a single woman, in this very uncomfortable position in an elevator at 4 a.m. in the morning. And she was saying this is the problem that with, the atheist community. Well, that might have been the end of it, except that then Richard Dawkins himself sort of decided to write a response to this vlog in a very sarcastic tone, in which he wrote a blog titled Dear Muslima, in which he took on the voice of a Muslim woman in a sort of, very repressed country in the Middle East, saying, I may be, being sort of tied up and sort of, having my hands cut off. But think of our poor American sisters who are having to put up with being asked for coffee in an elevator. So it was this very kind of sarcastic response. And basically, in doing so, he sort of poured gasoline on the whole debate. It absolutely exploded, and everyone was suddenly taking sides on this whole thing. It became to be dubbed Elevator Gate in the atheist community, and essentially it was sort of what later, in the whole area of Hollywood became the Me Too movement. It was kind of atheism's Me Too moment, and it was. And the whole movement split apart, even on that issue. There were those who were out with Rebecca Watson for feminism and saying, that the atheist movement needs to reform. It's far too much of these sort of misogynistic white men, basically, and others who were saying, hang on, I thought we were just here for the free thought and the radical skepticism. I didn't realize we were now all supposed to be feminists. So it all got very messy at that point. People started to have big arguments with each other. Some of these key atheist leaders started to fall out with each other on these issues. And it just then started to snowball into other issues as people started to demand that other particular issues were represented more at atheist conferences and in the movement and so on. Probably the thing that really put the nail in the coffin for the new atheist movement was the transgender movement, because that really split many of the people at the center of it. Richard Dawkins himself has been quite critical of transgender. He sees that there's an issue when it comes to biology with sort of men calling themselves women and vice versa. And for that, just for some of the criticisms he's leveled at transgender on Twitter, for instance, he a couple of years ago got stripped of his American Humanist Association Humanist of the Year award. They said, wow, we can no longer call you a humanist, Richard Dawkins, because you take this view. So it's just very interesting to see the way that these cultural social issues have completely divided the atheist community. And effectively, this was where all of that turmoil came from. And And what's interesting to me now is you ask, what are some of those key figures of the new atheism doing now? Well, they're not talking about atheism anymore. They're not really talking about God anymore. They've kind of completely moved off from that. And they're now, by and large, on one side or the other in the culture wars. That's where you'll find them now, because that's kind of become the new talking point. It's become the new enemy in some ways for many of them. They see that as far more of a pernicious threat to free speech and academic inquiry and so on than the religion that they used to critique ever was. So it's extraordinary how that movement has developed and gone in a completely different direction now.
Because if there is no God, there's no need for morals. So, transgenderism, sure, why not? Propositioning women in elevators, sure, why not? Because there's no morals.
But that's the whole thing. It's
right.
A very conflicted movement, because on the one hand, there's people who do take that kind of, well, anything goes kind of approach. We're just here, we should kind of make the rules up. And there's others who take a very different approach, who are very moralistic, who say, actually, no. There was a whole movement, called Atheism Plus. They were trying to say, well, yes, we're atheists, but it's plus, LGBT rights, feminism, and everything else. It was sort of like they weren't happy with the idea that atheists just stood for free thinking, rationality, science, or whatever. They wanted it to be a movement that actually got on board with all of the, the social issues of the time. So because people were going in different directions, it really soured the whole movement. And as I say, it got to the point where, no one could really talk to each other across these divides. And I'm not saying that, that often the church looks just as, divided as anything else, but it's just a factor for me, it was just a very good example of the way in which just that one idea that God doesn't exist, that's not going to sustain you for long. That's not going to kind of really be something that binds you together long enough to kind of actually create something good. It quickly unraveled. And for me, you have to have more than that. You have to have something positive ultimately to kind of center your life around, not just this negative claim about God.
Our guest on Pastor's Perspective today is Justin Briley. His new book is out in September. It's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and you can pre-order it right now on his website, justinbriley.com. Briley, again, is spelled B-R-I-E-R-L-E-Y, justinbriley.com. That's how you can find it. If you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, we've got the link there in the thread.
Well, Justin, I wonder if you would comment a little bit about the mental health issue. I mean, we are experiencing a tremendous mental health crisis, and this is important to you. You write about the meaning crisis in modern secular culture. How does this crisis relate to the mental health crisis?
I think that there are a lot of things that have gone into the mental health crisis that we're seeing in our culture. And you're right that some psychologists have also labeled this a meaning crisis as well. And I think there is a big link between those two things. At one level, that there are lots of kind of contemporary factors that have gone into, I think, the mental health crisis that we're facing, especially among young people. I think a lot of it is to do with technology, the rapid increase of the way in which we are now essentially using technology to communicate with each other, but kind of losing the human touch in the process. We're sort of feeling more alienated from each other. People are more connected than ever, but more lonely than ever. So I think that that's part of it. And the way in which the technology itself, social media and everything, kind of forces you to constantly having to be your best self or to cultivate and curate an identity and so on. I think that's incredibly burdensome on many young people. And I think it goes hand in hand with a certain form of woke culture where there is a sort of tendency to feel like you have to always have the right views in case you ever sort of get it wrong and you might land on the wrong side of the thought police and everything else. I think it all builds up to being quite it's a difficult time to be a young person today, because it's a confusing world and it's a world where you can get it wrong. It's a world where we're, as I said earlier, a lot of young people are being forced to kind of invent their identity almost from scratch. And that takes its toll. So I think that all feeds in the technology, the social issues that are going on to that mental health crisis. But I also think it goes deeper than that. I think in a way, all of that stuff has accelerated it in recent years. But I think for much longer than that, there's been something else going on, which I describe in the book as the non-story of reality. And it's it's this atheist materialist assumption that basically we are just DNA being propagated in a completely purposeless universe, essentially. It's the idea that we live in a clockwork universe where we're basically material beings that were always determined to be the way we are, and in a sense, any sense you have of purpose, identity, and meaning, it's actually an illusion. Really, you are just part of a kind of clockwork machine. That's the kind of the picture I tried to spell out in one of the chapters of the way in which this materialist sort of creed, this manifesto has kind of percolated down through the whole of our culture, so that the underlying sort of baseline, the white noise behind our culture is that basically what I think, say, or do doesn't really matter in the end, because it's none of it really has any meaning, has any ultimate purpose. And when you actually go and read what the atheist philosophers are saying, one of the most popular things that you'll find today is this doctrine of determinism, that basically you had absolutely no choice in who you are, what you would do, the values you hold, because actually all of that was decided from the birth of the universe, because we live in this universe of pure cause and effect in which everything that was ever going to happen did happen exactly the way it was always going to happen. And this, I think, is in a very funny way that has kind of seeped into our culture generally and made people feel like they're not the masters of their own destiny. And I think that in and of itself, just as a kind of background hum to all of this other stuff going on, is bound to create a sense of nihilism, a sense of that what does it matter? Does it make any difference the way I live my life, and that kind of thing? And so I see this going on, and basically I think we need to tell a different story to people. That's the story that's kind of been imbibed in our culture. But it's not the story people want to be true. All the stories we end up actually telling in our books, in our movies, in our music, they're about hope. They're about purpose. They're about, good triumphing over evil. They're about, Harry Potter winning over the forces of darkness, or Superman conquering, his latest enemy. And there's something in us that wants to say, even though the scientists and philosophers are saying this is the story, it's basically one of mindless purposelessness. On the other hand, all the stories we love telling tell a very different story. They say, no, life is full of purpose and meaning. There's a kind of there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a way in which it'll all come together in a beautiful kind of harmony in the end. So why is there this massive disjunct between the way we want the world to be and the way people claim it is? And I think it's because we've actually accepted a false narrative, a false story about the way the world is. And we need to introduce people again to the greatest story ever told, which does say you have ultimate value, ultimate purpose. You were put here for a reason, and you're so important that the God of the universe stepped into this story to rescue you, redeem you, and give you the opportunity to be part of a cosmic adventure. And I just think that is the ultimate answer to our mental health crisis. It's to give people their meaning back, basically. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but that's the way I see it.
That was a great answer. And, it's I think there's just so much truth to that. Just this past couple of days ago, I came home and Cheryl had two young guys knocked on the door. Hey, we want to clean your windows and it'll cost you this much. And she says, okay. Go ahead. So I come home, there's these two guys wandering around my house. I'm like, who are these people? What are they doing here? And, but long story short, I got into some fantastic conversations with them. And one of them, 26 years old, I really kind of went that angle, Justin, that you're talking about, of meaning and purpose. And he just began to open up and just say, I feel like there's something more to life than I'm experiencing, and I just can't escape it. It kind of keeps resurfacing over and over again, So it was a great opportunity to speak with him about the Lord. But I do think that at some point, I know that was a huge factor in my own conversion. I was in my early 20s wondering, man, what is life about? Because if it's just about this, I'm already in trouble. There needs to be something beyond this. So Justin, in the book, you have a number of stories about stories that are encouraging you that, something is really happening. What's one of your favorite stories of a person who's kind of an unexpected conversion type of event?
I mean, I really enjoyed the story of Paul Kingsnorth, who I sketch out his story in the final chapter. But again, he's one of those people who was himself completely surprised when he became a Christian. So Paul Kingsnorth is a celebrated author and poet here in the UK, an award-winning one. And for a long time, he was involved in the environmental movement. He was a noted sort of writer, an essay writer, and so on. And when I spoke to him about his journey, he said he had a kind of phase where he was a teenage atheist for a while, but he never kind of believed, as he put it, that the world really was disenchanted. And he always kind of had a hankering for something, kind of in the way that you've just described with that window cleaner, Brian. But he said he never, ever considered that it would be Christianity. He'd kind of like almost been turned off Christianity as a school kid, because he's here in the UK, we do have church schools, and he assumed that what he'd kind of imbibed, at school was boring, it was irrelevant, and he'd kind of consigned it to the dustbin. But he did start to go off in some interesting directions. He sort of spent a number of years in sort of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, thinking, well, maybe this is the way to kind of what I'm looking for. And he said it was helpful in some respects, but actually he found that it wasn't enough, because he constantly found that he wanted to worship something. And Buddhism doesn't give you anything to worship. It's essentially about the self. And he said he'd always been in love with nature, and there was something about nature that he just found so connective, so transcendent. And so he decided to join essentially a nature religion. He became a Wiccan for a while. He went out into the woods and did interesting rites and incantations with other people, because he thought, well, if I'm going to worship something, maybe it's nature that I need to worship. And again, he said what he discovered was that actually Wicca was a fairly modern invention, and was really just a kind of hashing together of some esoteric older religions and some new age things. And he thought it was a bit of fun, but he realized in the end that it was just a parody of Christianity, was what he said.
Wow.
Anyway, he was going through this journey, and he said suddenly he just started to hear from a number of people who were Christians, people who were reading his books, reading his blogs, and he thought, that's funny. And then he said, and he began to have more and more conversations with the Christians. He began to sort of, take some of the ideas more seriously. And he says there was one evening when, quite out of the blue, his wife, who was not a Christian, said to him, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, he was like, "What are you talking about?" But what happened in the end was that he went on this journey, and he began to have some very, very powerful dreams about Jesus, dreams that he couldn't ignore the power of. And he began to have experiences that he couldn't deny, essentially. And eventually he found that he was being drawn, almost kicking and screaming, out of Wicca into Christianity. And he's now a very committed Christian. A quite extraordinary journey, though, one which only, this conversion was only about 3 years ago. But he's drinking very deeply now of the Christian well. He's I read his stuff, and you'd think he'd been a Christian for decades, but he's an incredibly deep thinker. But he's just found that Christianity suddenly, the last thing he thought would make sense of his life, made absolute sense of everything he'd been looking for. And so he's just one of those extraordinary stories of someone who was not expecting to find that Christianity was the answer. He didn't have any sort of particularly church background. He wasn't coming out of that kind of thing. He was the last sort of candidate you would expect, but there he is, and I'm hearing more of those kinds of stories, and I find it very exciting. I think God's up to something.
What was his name again?
That's Paul Kingsnorth. If you want to read a great sort of very brief sort of summary, he wrote a great essay for First Things called "The Cross and the Machine," which really tells his story of conversion.
Wow. It's a bit C.S. Lewis-ish, that kind of the most reluctant convert kind of a thing.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I love
and
that.
he would say that he has since, having, always read C.S. Lewis as a kid, he's now found this huge fresh appreciation for Lewis, which because he does see so much of his journey reflected in Lewis's own journey.
Yeah, I love that.
Justin, when you think about your book, I wonder now if we come inside the local church. We've talked a little bit about your engagement, Brian, with the window cleaners, and we've talked about the new atheists, and we've talked about kind of how you've interviewed different people, probably the most networked Christian apologists in the world. I wouldn't be surprised if it's you, Justin. I mean, you know everybody, but when it comes to getting inside the church, what do we need to do differently? I mean, we're living in a melting pot culture of beliefs. As pastors, some people are even reticent to doing Christian apologetics. I would wonder, what are your thoughts on that? And then what type of things would you want to say to our audience if Brian or myself didn't get that question? You want to make sure you tell people who are driving around in their car, hey, listen up.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and I tried to spell some of that out towards the end of the book, lessons that the church could learn from where we're at in this current moment. One of them is always be aware of the questions people are asking now. Sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking we know what the questions people are asking are, but there's sometimes questions from 10 years ago, and sometimes with apologetics, which has kind of been, like you, Bobby, I've been in this world a long time. It's sometimes easy to just focus on the questions the new atheists were asking, because they were kind of solid questions, which, we knew kind of how to answer. But actually the conversation has moved on. People aren't as influenced now by that new atheism, and they're asking far more questions about purpose and identity and meaning. And I think you need to be aware of that. And so the primary question on a young person's mind today probably isn't, does God exist? It's probably, how am I going to make sense of my life today, given all the options that are on offer to me? So that doesn't mean that obviously God isn't the ultimate answer to that question, but you might have to start the conversation in a different way. It might not be about pulling out the Kalam cosmological argument. It might be about doing something different. It might be about saying, well, look, a different kind of cultural approach, saying, well, why are you so passionate about, equality? What does that tell us about who you are and what matters to you, and whether there is we're living in a natural and moral universe? And that might be the way in. It might be that actually we need to do more engaging people with their imagination, because a lot of the stories I've heard actually and recorded in this book are they're always a combination of intellect and imagination that brought people across the line to Christian faith. Certainly there are often those intellectual questions, but actually it's about showing people that they want it to be true. Going back to that Tom Holland thing, he says the thing that's kind of draws him most to Christianity is the imaginative power of it, the sense that he really wants it to be true, because it's just such a good story. It's such a captivating story. And again, referencing C.S. Lewis, I think he was the master of doing this. When he wrote, straight Christian apologetics books like, Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, that were kind of giving, very intellectual answers to the questions. But then later on in his life, he kind of went more in the direction of writing fiction. And he obviously wrote Narnia, his best-selling children's stories. I think he was doing apologetics with Narnia, though. It was just a different kind of apologetics. He was showing people a world that they wished was true. People still, even as adults, check the back of the wardrobe just in case there's a secret portal to a magical world. But he was showing them a world full of justice and valor and this extraordinary king who was a lion over it. And people wanted that to be true. And what he was saying was, well, what if it is true? What if that world really does exist in our world? And I think it's only once you show people what they want to be true that they're then kind of going to be open to being shown that it is true. And that's where you get the important work of apologetics, But it's for me, we've sometimes not done both of those things. We've not always kind of engaged the imagination with people and shown them why they want it to be true. So that's another important point. And just one more thing really is that so many of the people I've met who have either converted to Christianity or are kind of somewhere on the path towards it, what they've frequently said to me is, please, I'm not interested in a version of church that's just a kind of warmed over humanism, that's a kind of dumbed down version of church, that's sort of lost its real central message. And I think the church, as some of them say, we need to keep Christianity weird. They want the mystery, they want the weirdness, they want the full-blooded experience of Christianity, because they don't want just another version of what they already get in the world, basically. Yeah. They want something that's different and that says that there's something out there, there's a different world. So I would say that's the thing to do. Keep Christianity weird.
Such a hopeful interview, because so many people listening always call us with, my kids are deconstructing their faith and everything. You know what? They just might come back and be ready to embrace them. You've got to read this book by Justin Briley, JustinBriley, JustinBriley.com. It comes out in September, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. God bless you guys. Pastor's Perspective was sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.